Good morning, everybody. This is a beautiful place, isn't it? For some reason, it's harder to get psyched up about going to work here than it is in the Pentagon, where you know pain awaits, and so you get dressed up for it for some crazy reason. Thank you so much for having us. AFA, thank you for putting on another fantastic event. Mr. Secretary, thank you for taking your time to be here. Secretary's been a little under the weather, so he's fighting through it to be with us this week. Chief Cody, it's great to have you here. In fact, if I could get the first slide, please. Let me start with a picture that Chief Cody might recognize. There you go. A little over 20 years ago, 1990, there he is. Staff Sergeant Jim Cody and his wife, Senior Airman Athena Cody. Pretty amazing. And I'm betting when this picture was taken, he had no idea he'd be sitting in the front row of the Rosen Resort at the AFA convention as our brand new 17th Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force. But he's not here by accident, folks. He's here because he's had a phenomenal career. He's an air traffic controller by trade. When he had this picture taken, despite looking pretty cocky about that ridiculous looking bow tie, Chief, it's like the flying nun of bow ties. He had no idea that he'd go on to be the distinguished graduate of every PME course he went to, and that he'd win things like Squadron and Wing NCO of the Year and Major Command Senior NCO of the Year awards, or that he'd be a command chief at the wing level, the Numbered Air Force level, the Expeditionary Mobility Task Force level, and the Major Command level. Or that by the time he was sitting in this front row, he'd have a reputation for hands-on leadership all over the Air Force, everywhere he'd been. He's a phenomenal senior NCO. He is going to be a great, great Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, and it is great to have you on the team, buddy. Welcome to the jungle. Before I leave the slide, I should probably point out that Chief wasn't just a good air traffic controller. He was the second best air traffic controller in his family. Because Athena is also a retired Chief Master Sergeant in the Air Force, a retired Chief Master Sergeant in our Air Force, also an air traffic controller, and she taught Jim everything he knows. So we got a team here that understands being military parents, being military professionals, being military leaders. They've got a son who's a senior airman in our Air Force on his way to an assignment at Nosan Air Base in Korea. They've got a daughter who they've just pulled to her third high school in 3.5 years. They understand the business. They understand the impacts on people. This is going to be a good thing. Next slide. Let me start where all things start, by talking about airmen. 690,000 of them, all components, all walks and races and intellects and backgrounds and concerns and family types. They're just incredible people, as you know. And whether they fly airplanes or diffuse IEDs or fix engines or do administrative work in the Pentagon, God bless them, they're remarkable. They believe in integrity. They try and do the right thing. They believe in service. They're ready and they're willing to go in harm's way, and they believe in excellence. They work all the time to make things better wherever they are, just like Cat Lily does. This is Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Cat Lily. Actually, this is one of those cardboard cutouts of Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Cat Lily. The kids call her Flat Mom. That's not real complimentary, I don't think, in her eyes. Her husband Mike's a former F-16 crew chief, now a GS civilian in our Air Force, and he calls this Flat Cat. This is Flat Cat celebrating Christmas dinner with the family. They take her everywhere. They took her to pictures with Santa. They take her to school plays, and they send her the videos because she is in Shindan Air Base at Afghanistan. And the journey to Shindan actually started in Beaver Marsh, Oregon when she was 9 years old, and her father, a guy named Jim Wolf, used to take her to these small town air shows at this dirt strip that he managed. And she fell in love with aviation. So she went to the University of Oregon, joined Air Force ROTC, and wanted to be a pilot, but her eyes weren't good enough. So one of her instructors in the ROTC program was a maintenance officer, convinced her she really ought to think about that. And he arranged a trip to watch the B-1 maintenance team at one of our Air Force bases. And after she saw that, she was hooked. Later, she worked on those same B-1s. She's also worked on KC-135s and F-15s and F-16s. She's a pretty special lady. She's currently on her 4th deployment, this time out in the middle of nowhere in western Afghanistan, teaching the Afghan Air Force as a squadron commander of an air advisory squadron overseeing maintenance training for the new Afghan Air Force. During the time she's been there, they have a fixed-wing squadron and a rotary wing squadron. Sortie generation capability in the fixed-wing squadron has increased 400%. In the rotary wing squadron, 300%. The squadrons are now generating their own regional command and control for airlift, aeromedical evacuation, and air support missions. They never did that before in Afghanistan. The Afghan Air Force is living, it's growing, it's starting to kind of stretch its wings a little bit. They've got a ways to go, but people like Kat Lilly and the team with her there are helping them get there. She's doing this in a country and a society that doesn't value the contributions of women at all times. She's respected by her peers, by her subordinates, by the people she's training, and she's setting an example that they're going to follow for generations. Airmen rock. They just rock. Next slide. This doesn't. I love this picture. The fiscal cliff is real, folks. It's staring us right in the face, and it's only a few days away. This is a big deal. Our Air Force is facing a shortfall if sequestration occurs of about $12.4 billion in FY13, the remainder of the year. An overseas contingency operations funding shortfall of about $1.8 billion based on the continuing resolution that we're still under. Now, all this is on top of the $200 billion or so during the last year of the Secretary Gates administration and the $487 billion, our share of that, from the Budget Control Act of 2011. This is a big deal. The cuts are significant, they're deep, they're going to hurt, and they will change the way we see the future. That's what's coming. Next slide. Last week, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the OSD Comptroller, and the Service Chiefs testified before the House and the Senate Armed Services Committee about the effects of sequestration on the readiness of the United States military. We spoke with a very unified voice. We talked about the different actions each of the services has taken. And when we were done with that, we answered questions from the committee. From the Air Force perspective, we've taken lots of actions that we could in the near term, things we consider reversible. All of those actions combined, though, will probably get us about 20% of the way toward that $14.2 billion total that we'll need to find if sequestration occurs. The rest of the cuts are going to come from people, modernization, readiness, and infrastructure accounts. This on a force that's been at war for the last 22 years. Next slide. Let's talk about some of those impacts. You know, we've already released thousands of temp and term employees, several thousand folks. We've already got a civilian hiring freeze in place. On Tuesday, the department released a furlough notice to all of our civilian airmen, 180,000 of them, advising them that starting mid to late April, they could be furloughed for as much as 22 days over the rest of the fiscal year. That's a significant impact. Just from an operational perspective, that's about 31.5 million man-hours of work in some very specialized areas in many cases over the rest of this fiscal year. 31.5 million hours. More importantly, it's a breach of faith, in my view, with a critical part of our population. Our civilian workforce hasn't had a pay raise in, I guess, the last 3 years. And now we're talking about furloughing them without pay, which will cost them about 20% of their pay for the remainder of this fiscal year. This is a significant chunk of our population and a critical piece of it. 40% of our cyber force is civilian. 50% of our space force is civilian. There are some mission areas where it's 100% civilian managed and run. Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas is our largest pilot training production base. Maintenance is civilian. Simulator training is civilian. It's the same at other Air Education Training Command bases. This will have an impact. And it's just one example. Next slide. You know, our readiness levels have been declining in the Air Force since 2003. We're not doing great even before all this stuff starts. We've essentially set aside full spectrum training just because we had to support the current fight. Our intent this year, with a big push by the Secretary in our program, was to kind of get back to that full spectrum training and improve readiness again. This is going to make it very hard to do. We'll lose about 30% if sequestration occurs of our remaining flying hours and weapon system sustainment funding. Now, what that means in practical terms is that while we'll continue to support the fight in Afghanistan and other named operations, we'll continue to support nuclear deterrent activity, we'll continue to do initial flight training, virtually everything else is impacted. Mike Hostage is going to have to take the active duty combat air forces, and starting the 1st of March, we will start to curtail flying training. By mid-May, they will be below acceptable combat levels, and about 70% of our CAF will be completely non-mission capable by July. We'll close about 10 training ranges here in the U.S. about the same time in July, including places like the Utah Test and Training Range and the Nevada Test and Training Range. This is a big deal. We'll stop doing exercises like Red Flag and Green Flag and Commando Sling and Cope Tiger. On the Mobility Air Force's side, we're going to have curtailed airdrop training. We could lose as many as 21,000 training jumps for the United States Army. We'll lose the ability to do air refueling training, both for our own forces and for coalition partners, because we simply won't have the flying hours to fly. We're going to lose about 200,000 flying hours in this effort in the last 6 months of the year. It's a big deal. On the training side of the house, we'll continue to protect the resources to do initial flight training, but on the 1st of April, Ed Rice will stop doing advanced flight training programs. Things like instructor pilot upgrades, requalification for experienced pilots coming back from staff jobs, those kind of things. All these things are gifts that keep on giving. And it will create a bow weight that will be very difficult to recover from. It'll take a long time. That 30% weapon system sustainment support reduction we talked about means that we'll have about 150 aircraft and about 85 engines that won't go into depot. All the work that happens in the depot, supported by small businesses in the local area providing spare parts, et cetera, is now going to be affected. Those businesses will be affected. It's not just the depot workforce that's furloughed. We now have a problem in the businesses that support us. Industry partners here know all about that. This is a big deal. Next slide. On the infrastructure side, we've already delayed 100 plus projects in 52 different places around the world. We've got 14 more we'll delay if sequestration occurs. Sustainment projects in another 12 bases. We've got dormitory projects we won't start. 22 MILCON projects that have been delayed. We've got about 220 energy-focused projects that we can't start. There's lots of stuff impacted by this. Next slide. In our modernization accounts, we're not really sure what the impact will be. The F-35 program will lose up to 3 aircraft this production year if sequestration occurs. The RDT&E accounts will also be affected, which puts software development at risk, which affects IOC dates for us. KC-46 program, we hope the cuts will be below the 10 to 12% range overall, which means that that contract is not threatened, which is a great thing for us. But who knows what future top line will mean to program structure. We'll have to wait and see. We intended to buy a second SBIR satellite on this year's contract, but because of the continuing resolution, we can't change the quantities of the current award, which means we may have to wait and buy the second satellite later. That will cost us an additional $1 billion over the initiative that we had worked out with our industry partners this year. Our test and evaluation programs are all going to be delayed. It could cause as much as a tripling of our test costs across all of our programs, and of course delay fielding capability. And then programs like the Long Range Strike Bomber and others, we'll have to wait and see the impact. Next slide. Okay, so that's the good news. Actually, that's just what's happening. It doesn't change how great our Air Force is, but it may affect what we do in the future, what we look like in the future, how big we are in the future. During all this change, I think it's important that we have some kind of stability. And so we've released a new vision for our Air Force. It's actually pretty simple. It's focused on 3 things: airmen, mission, innovation. The theme for this conference. Imagine that. It highlights the significance of airmen as the power of our Air Force. It talks about and reminds us of the 5 enduring missions that we were assigned when we first became a proud Air Force in 1947. They haven't changed, and they're not likely to change in the future. And it kind of embraces innovation as almost a genetic trait of every airman. It's kind of in our DNA. We came from technology. And we have to figure out how to harness it and use it to our advantage in the future. It's pretty simple. It's 1,000 words long. You can read it in 3 minutes. If you haven't seen it, let me know. I'll send you a copy. Next slide. Here's the mission areas it talks about. It talks about those 5 enduring missions. We've added space. It used to just be air superiority. Now we've added space superiority. We also added cyber and space enablers to do those other missions, but basically the missions have remained unchanged since 1947. They're still accomplished by incredible airmen, and the net effect, the product that we provide for the nation, is global vigilance, global reach, and global power. It's a pretty simple concept, and we are incredibly good at it. I've been talking a lot about airmen and innovation lately, so today I want to talk about just those three things, the meat of what we do, the centerpiece of that vision, our mission. And I wish I could stand up here and talk to you about all the aircraft we're going to do it with, manned and unmanned, the systems that we're going to put together to make it happen, the new technology that we're investing in, the acquisition programs that'll breathe life into it. I wish I could tell you about all that stuff and weave you the tapestry that the Secretary has designed. Unfortunately, right now, we have no idea what it's going to look like until we figure out, as the Secretary said, a reliable string of numbers. What's the top line going to look like for the next 10 years, really? And what does that mean to the Air Force, and how does that change what we're planning? So until I can come back and have that conversation with you with some kind of certainty, let me look at global vigilance, reach, and power through a different lens. Next slide. You know, the discussion about global vigilance these days tends to center on remotely piloted aircraft, for good reason. Your Air Force airmen have flown almost 1.5 million combat hours in the Predator and Reaper. And there are some industry folks in this room who ought to be very proud of that number. Global Hawk's flown almost 60,000 combat hours now, or somewhere in that vicinity. They do incredible things every single day all over the world. But the face of global vigilance is not an unmanned aircraft. It's Phil Miller. He's a 2005 graduate of the United States Air Force Academy, distinguished graduate, in fact. When he graduated, he went off to graduate school at the University of Colorado in Boulder and got a degree in civil engineering. He's a pretty smart kid. After that, he went to pilot training, then became one of our first pilots to go directly into the U-28, that aircraft you see in the picture, flying with Air Force Special Operations Command. And in the 4 years or so that he's been doing this mission for our Air Force, he has 1,800 combat hours. He's now in the top 1% of all Air Force pilots in combat flying hours. Not bad for a new captain. He's a pretty impressive guy. Phil Miller believes in this mission. He loves doing it. He has identified, tracked, and helped eliminate known terrorists. He supported and defended coalition and joint and U.S. airmen on the battlefield. And he's done it all relentlessly, often flying back-to-back long endurance missions. If you're going to be vigilant, you got to be where the action is. And young Captain Miller, when he finishes up the weapons instructor course he's going through right now, the first one for the U-28, will head off on his next deployment, his 9th. Also not bad for a brand new captain. Next slide. I believe Veronica Cox may be here today. Veronica, you here? No? Veronica Fox is an intel airman. When this picture was taken, she was assigned to Kadena Air Base in Japan. This was in 2011. And she was at Kadena as an intel analyst when the earthquake actually devastated Japan and all the aftermath that came. Because she spoke fluent Japanese, she volunteered to help in any way she could. And so one night, sitting on a Pavehawk helicopter doing damage assessment and intel collection from that helicopter, they flew over an area of the local landscape where she saw a bunch of rocks arranged on the ground in the low light that looked like Japanese characters. So she asked the pilot to descend. She saw that, and no kidding, it was a sign calling for help. She directed him to go lower, and they found 200 isolated civilians. She hoisted down to the roof of the building they were in. And when her feet hit the top of the roof, she yelled in Japanese, "We're the U.S. Air Force, and we're here to help." I wish I had a tape of that. I should have asked Carlisle to yell that in Japanese. What an incredible story. She helped save 200 lives that night. And on 9 more combat search and rescue missions, she saved a lot more. If you're going to be vigilant, you got to be engaged. This young lady is. This is what global vigilance looks like to the rest of the world. Next slide. Our mobility airmen do absolutely incredible things, whether they're supporting humanitarian relief operations in pick a place, Haiti, Pakistan, Libya, Tunisia, you pick one. Or they're moving coalition troops in places like Mali, or moving to support non-combatant evacuation in the Levant or elsewhere, or whether they're supporting our operations in the Middle East with more airdrop last year alone than we did in the entire Korean War to 40 different forward operating bases. They do phenomenal work. They also do incredible work in the air medical evacuation business. They've moved 170,000 patients since 9/11, 170,000 with about a 97% survival rate. Every 2 minutes, every hour, every day of the year, the Strategic Airlift Sortie launches for the United States of America. That's what Paul Selva and his team do. Every day, they move 4 million pounds of cargo. Every day, they offload 600,000 gallons of fuel on average. What an incredible story. Major Joanna Jackson's a doctor. She's part of that air medical evacuation system. In 2011, she volunteered to depart TDY from her base at Joint Base Langley Eustis. She's an emergency room doc. And to go forward as part of one of the first tactical critical care evacuation teams, an AMC initiative that basically put medical care in the form of an emergency medicine doc and 2 nurse anesthetists as far forward as possible to grab casualties as close to the point of injury as they could to escort them back to better medical care. She was on the first team. They responded to a mortar attack in eastern Afghanistan, and when they got there, Army Specialist Donnie Esslinger, who you see in this picture, was lying by the side of the road, a victim of that mortar blast, and he was bleeding to death. He had terrible injuries, including a massive hole in the side of his head, on the left side of his head. She treated him there in the dust. She put lines into his chest. She put lines into his heart. She put lines into his arteries. She basically kept him alive and then escorted him back to a forward operating base where he was then medically evacuated to Bagram, to Landstuhl, to Walter Reed. He made a full recovery. Actually received a Purple Heart from President Obama, which is pretty cool. Of course, Doc Jackson didn't get to come back with him. She stayed in Afghanistan because she had other wounded warriors to save. But when she returned to Langley about 7 months later, Specialist Esslinger came to visit. That's when this picture was taken. And she was so astonished by his recovery, she had to touch the place that where she'd seen the hole in the side of his head and had bandaged it on that battlefield. What a moment this must have been for both of them. Global reach. Next slide. Chief Cody and I were at Ali Al Salim Air Base in Kuwait a couple weeks ago. We were having lunch with a bunch of airmen, and one of them was Mohammed Bekmetovic. Talk about a story. He was born in Srebrenica, Bosnia. In 1995, he was 6 years old when the ethnic cleansing began. 80% of his family was eliminated. That's the word he used. Killed in the genocide. For the next several years, they left their home. They hid out in the mountain passes. They tried to survive. The only thing that kept them alive was resupply by air from U.S. airlift, principally from C-130s. He told us about running out to find the C-130 pilots, getting the food, and running back into the woods, and that's what kept them alive. His exact words were, "The United States Air Force saved my life." Later, he was sponsored by a relative who'd gotten to the States to move under a new State Department program back to the U.S., and he and his mother and father did that. He went to school in the U.S., learned English, graduated from high school, went to a recruiter, and enlisted in the United States Air Force to pay back his country. He's now a transportation journeyman at Little Rock Air Force Base. He loads C-130 pallets. His dream is to fly C-130s and deliver life-saving aid to people around the world. My bet is he'll make it. That's global reach. Next slide. That's Lieutenant Ralph Parr. Anybody here know Ralph Parr? Some of you had to know him. Many of you know of him, I know. This picture was taken in 1944 when Lieutenant Parr was heading off to World War II flying the P-38 Lightning. Pretty incredible life story. After that combat tour, he came back, returned to combat in Korea, in an F-80 on his first combat tour, returned from that tour, checked out in the F-86, which you see in the picture here, developed the air-to-air tactics for that airplane, and then returned for a second tour in Korea flying the F-86. And in one remarkable 11-day, 30-mission period, he shot down 10 enemy aircraft and became a double ace. On one mission, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for single-handedly attacking 10 MiGs. Gotta like that. Pretty amazing guy. In the interwar years, early 60s, he helped develop the F-4C and bring it into the operational inventory as one of our first instructors. Along with many of you, he became an F-4 squadron commander. He flew the F-4 on 2 combat tours in Vietnam. By the time he retired in 1976, Colonel Parr had flown about 6,000 hours in fighter aircraft. He'd flown 641 combat missions, 5 combat tours, 4 different aircraft, 3 wars. He wore 60 decorations, including the Distinguished Service Cross, the Air Force Cross, awarded for extraordinary valor in Khe Sanh. He wore the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, 10 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and 41 Air Medals. And he carried our respect. On December 7th, Ralph Parr peacefully passed away and flew west and became a treasured memory of our Air Force. And we should all stand a little prouder because we follow in his footsteps. And we should all celebrate because we share that global power legacy that he began and that he passed on to, next slide. Next slide. That he passed on to Megan Sylvester. All 5'0" of her. Megan's a pretty impressive young lady. She works at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. She was born in Rapid City, South Dakota, to an Air Force airman, a young A1C who later was commissioned, is now a communications officer in our Air Force and works on the Joint Staff. Megan runs a convoy response force. Her job is to lead a 42-person specially trained security forces team that moves nuclear weapons to and from the missile fields and then recovers them if there's an issue. She's really good at it. She's led 100 nuclear weapon convoy missions during her time at Minot. 100. And if you talk to her airmen, they'll tell you how impressive she is. As she was showing us a demo of this convoy, she decided she wanted to show us something a little bit different, so she said, would you guys mind just waiting here and I'm going to go rearrange something? I said, okay, whatever she said. We stood by the side of the truck, and as we were standing there, one of her flight chiefs and a guy who was obviously a new airman first class in the unit came walking around the back of the truck and stood kind of around the corner from us. They didn't know we were there. And they were talking, and the A1C was asking questions about how often do we do this, where do we go, how far away are the missile fields. So he was clearly the new guy. And as Lieutenant Sylvester came running by to go get something arranged, he saw her go by and he made a comment to the master sergeant after she got out of range. Hey, she's not very tall, is she? And the master sergeant, as soon as the words were out of his mouth, I took out a pen and I wrote down exactly what he said. He said, Airman, it don't matter how tall she is. LT Sly's got game. LT Sly's got game. Yes, she does. And she is global power for America. She needs to know that. We need to tell her. Next slide. So is this guy. This is DeVell Adams. His mom and dad are both Army NCOs. He's from South Carolina. He's a chef in a missile alert facility at F.E. Warren, Wyoming. He spends 16 days a month in the missile fields, 4 days at a time. He starts work at 5 in the morning. He leaves work about 8 at night after he finishes cleaning up the kitchen after dinner for the missile crews. And the security guys always want an after-dinner snack. He's a pretty amazing guy. He knows he's responsible for morale. He has a huge part in that, and he kind of thrives on that knowledge. If you talk to DeVell, you feel good about yourself. You feel good about life. You feel great about our Air Force. If our missile alert crews and the teams that support them can't operate in the missile fields, we can't do nuclear deterrence. Without DeVell Adams, they can't. Without them, we don't have nuclear deterrence. Said another way, no DeVell Adams, no global power. DeVell Adams needs to understand that. We need to understand that. Next slide. You guys have heard all about these guys. Got one of them sitting right over here. He's one of our outstanding airmen of the year. There's a great Air Force one-star named Jack Briggs who works down at Air Combat Command. He tells a story about flying an F-15E-2 ship into a battle space in Afghanistan. And as he arrived in an ambush site in eastern Afghanistan where an Army patrol had been ambushed, they knew they were wounded on the ground. They responded to the troops in contact call and were trying to figure out how to best help. And when they arrived, they initially connected with the ground control party, the Joint Tactical Air Controller and the Tactical Air Control Party airmen supporting them, the two guys you see on the slide. And after they got the situation on the ground, which is an incredible thing that happens here in this transition, because their job is to take the ground commander's perspective on what's going on, translate it to people in the air, explain what the ground commander wants them to do, the effect he wants them to create, and then make sure it's executed perfectly. All in the confusion of battle, with bullets flying by your head, dust swirling, whatever the conditions on the ground are affecting everything you do. So as they first made radio contact with Airman First Class Corey Hughes, he was yelling into the mics to make sure he could be heard over the gunfire they could hear in the background. He was making short, kind of staccato radio calls so he could put the mic down and fire his weapon in between them. At one point in time, as he started to give him the game plan, he stopped and said, "Stand by," and everything went quiet. And they orbited overhead wondering what was going on. Later, he came back on the radio. He gave him the plan. He wanted him to do a show of force pass, create some space so we could get helicopters in to pick up the team on the ground and evacuate them, and the plan went perfectly. After getting back to Bagram that night, General Briggs headed over to the Craig Theater Hospital, which he did often to visit with the wounded and see if there were any from the battle that day. And in fact, there were some already in the emergency room by the time he arrived and in the ICU. So he visited with him for a while. They, of course, thanked him for the help that the air power was able to provide. And as he got ready to leave, one soldier in the back of the room was kind of yelling at him frantically, telling him to come over at him. And when he got to him, the guy's lying there without a shirt on. There's blood everywhere. He'd been shot through both legs. And he said, "Sir, thank the TAC-P for me." And Jack said, "Okay, can you give me a little more than that?" And he goes, "Yeah, I don't know who he is." He said, "I just know that I got shot. I went down. I couldn't move. I was in the middle of the hot zone. And this guy came out of nowhere, picked me up, and carried me about 200 meters on a fireman's carry over his shoulder to get me out of danger." He said, "I wish I knew his name, but all I know is I was bouncing along there on his shoulder. I just saw the patch that said TAC-P. Thank him for me, would you?" And so General Briggs went back and found the TAC-P there in First Class Corps Hughes. And it turns out when he said stand by, what he had done is seen the soldier go down, ran over, picked him up, he carried him to safety, made sure he was situated, ran back, picked up the microphone, started firing again, finished the mission brief. This whole time with suppressing fire being provided by Senior Airman Garner, who's talking to other aircraft on another frequency. Global power for America. I don't know, they're 10 years old. They're lethal. They're unbelievably talented. They're scary good at what they do. And they just make us proud. Next slide. Our Air Force is pretty darn good. The people in it are unbelievably good. And we're going to get through this financial mess that we're kind of mired in right now. And when we come out the other end, we're going to be exactly what we were when we went into the front end. We're going to be the best Air Force in the world. You and I are going to make sure that happens. Secretary will get rid of me in a heartbeat if he doesn't think that's where we're headed. So I'm not worried about that, because we got them. And they can do anything. Anything. If we help them. Next slide. One of the things that surprised me since I got this job is the number of reports I get every day about life as it affects the Air Force. Not technology, not mission area stuff, not innovation, just life. Since I took the job, we've averaged about 1.6 deaths per day in our Air Force. Not combat deaths, just deaths. I was surprised by that. And every now and then I think it's important for us to kind of step back and realize that all the things that affected the Air Force when so many of you served are the same. We share this lifestyle, this inherent risk of mission, this love of the thrill of things like flying and working on the battlefield and doing incredibly difficult things. We share that. We share it across national lines, we share it across service lines, we share it as an institution of the profession of arms. And every now and then I think it's good to remind ourselves that that's important to us. Next slide. A couple of years back, I had the chance to speak at the final F-16 training course graduation from the Springfield Air National Guard Base in Ohio. Fantastic base, fantastic training unit, fantastic course. One of the guys who graduated from the class that night was a young lieutenant named Luke Grunther. Kind of a tall, lanky drink of water, fired up guy, excited about life, excited about the Air Force, had a reputation for being kind of everybody's buddy, loved the world, happy all the time, loved what he was doing, couldn't wait to get out in the Air Force and make a difference, like so many of our great airmen. And he did. He ended up at Aviano Air Base in the Triple Nickel Fighter Squadron. He became a great F-16 pilot. He was the chief of safety at Aviano. On January 28th of this year, he was flying a four-ship, and during the four-ship, he separated from his flight, and he went missing, somewhere over the Adriatic Sea. For 3 days in terrible weather, they looked for him. At the end of the second day, they found a debris field in the water. The morning of the third day, they found Luke, his body. Next slide. Luke's married to Cassie. She's a great lady. They're a great couple. They're energetic. They're engaged. They're outdoor people. They like to do a lot of things. They're just kind of the model young Air Force couple. Next slide. I'm sorry, can you back up one? Should be one more build on that last one, is there? Okay, don't worry about it. Last week, at the beginning of the week, they had a memorial service at Aviano Air Base in Italy, in Hangar 3. For those of you who've been there, there were 1,000 people in the memorial service. In that memorial service, there were members of the 173rd Airborne Brigade from Vicenza, Italy, who came over, who knew Luke from being supported by him in Afghanistan. The teams that worked together pretty closely, they knew him, they respected him, they came to pay their respects. There were 1,000 others in that hangar. Great ceremony from what I heard. You know, his buddies made everybody laugh. His wife made him cry with her eulogy. His wife, Cassie, was there with her mom and his mom, along with other members of their family. And at the end of the ceremony, they walked outside and they watched the missing man formation approach the base. Luke's brother, who's also in the Air Force, saluted. And I like to believe as number 3 pulled into the vertical and that missing man flyby, that Luke was riding with him. I think his mom thought so too, because the picture I can't find here, and I'm sorry, is actually his mom waving goodbye as that airplane pulled up into the vertical. And I think Luke just kept right on going. He touched the face of God. The next morning, Cassie delivered their first child. A beautiful little girl she named Serene. Now, she'll never know her father, but she'll know all about him. And as Secretary Donnelly said, she will always be the daughter of an American airman. And so the line goes on. And so many of you stand in it. And I'm so honored to stand with you. Not too long ago, one of our young airmen asked me why I still liked being in the Air Force. And after reminding him that I didn't like being in the Air Force, I loved being in the Air Force, he said, yeah, but why? And I started to say kind of the typical, well, because of the airmen. And then I stopped and realized it's more than that. It's not just the airmen. It's what they stand for. I just said hi before I started this morning to a young senior airman I've never met, right here in the second row. I'll tell you what I love about our Air Force. I've known you now for about 40 minutes. But I'd die for you. So would Craig McKinley. So would Ed Rice. So would Janet Wolfenbarger. And so would everybody else in this front row. And so would almost everybody sitting behind you. And I'm just naive enough to believe that you do the same for me. How can you not love being in this business? It is such a privilege to serve. And it's an honor to be here with you today. Air power. Gots to have some. Thanks, everybody.